Mark had worked his entire life for this moment. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of freshly cut grass as he pulled into the driveway of his new home. A modest but beautiful house in a well-kept neighborhood. The kind of place where kids rode their bikes without a care, and neighbors exchanged friendly waves across manicured lawns. For the first time in years, Mark felt like he had truly made it. No more noisy apartments, no more landlords dictating his every move. This was his home. But the feeling of peace didn't last long. It started with a small yellow slip of paper tucked under his windshield wiper. At first he thought it was just a flyer or a delivery notice, but when he unfolded it, bold red letters glared back at him. Violation notice. Unauthorized. Vehicle parking. Mark frowned. He had read through the HOA rules before moving in, and nowhere did it say he couldn't park in his own driveway. Maybe it was a mistake. A clerical error? He crumpled the notice and tossed it aside, not thinking much of it. The next morning, there was another one. Same message. Same warning. Only this time it came with a fine. $50. Annoyed but not alarmed, Mark decided to call the HOA office. The woman on the other end was polite but robotic. "It's a rule," she said. "All homeowners must keep their vehicles in the garage overnight." Mark glanced at the HOA handbook sitting on his counter. He had read it cover to cover. That rule didn't exist. "Are you sure?" he pressed. "Because I don't see that written anywhere in the guidelines." There was a pause on the other. "And?" Then the woman's voice turned icy. "It's an unwritten policy, sir. I suggest you comply." A chill ran down Mark's spine. Something about her tone, calm but firm, almost rehearsed, set off a warning bell in his head. He had dealt with HOAs before, but this felt personal. Shrugging it off, he figured it was just an overzealous HOA board trying to flex their authority. He'd park in his driveway again that night and see what happened. After all, they couldn't fine him for a rule that didn't exist, right? Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. The next morning, Mark stepped out onto his porch, coffee in hand, ready to enjoy the crisp morning air. But as he reached his mailbox, a thick, official-looking envelope sat on top of his usual mail. His stomach tightened as he ripped it open, already sensing trouble. Notice of violation. Unauthorized parking. His eyes scanned the letter, each line making his frustration grow. According to the HOA, parking in his driveway overnight was a breach of community standards, and he had 7 days to comply before additional fines would be issued. If he failed to do so, legal action could follow. Legal action? Over parking in his own driveway? This had to be a mistake. Mark stormed back inside and grabbed the HOA handbook from his kitchen counter. He flipped through page after page, scanning for any mention of driveway parking restrictions. Nothing. The closest rule he found was about street parking. Homeowners couldn't leave their cars on the road overnight. But that wasn't his situation. His car was in his driveway, his own property. Confusion gave way to irritation as he reached for his phone. Within seconds, he had the HOA's number dialed. After a few rings, the same woman from before answered. "Homeowners Association office? How can I assist you?" "Yeah, I just got a violation letter about my car being in my driveway," Mark said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I've checked the HOA guidelines, and there's no rule against this. Can you clarify what's going on?" There was a pause, followed by the same robotic response as last time. "It's an unwritten policy that all vehicles must be stored inside. Garages overnight." Mark clenched his jaw. "An unwritten policy? How can I break a rule that doesn't even exist in writing?" "The board has the authority to enforce community standards as they see fit," she said smoothly. "Failure to comply may result in fines or further action." Mark exhaled sharply, gripping the phone tighter. This is ridiculous. You can't just make up rules and expect people to follow them." The woman's voice remained eerily calm. "Sir, if you have concerns, you're welcome to attend the next HOA meeting." Mark's frustration boiled over, but he forced himself to stay composed. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "When's the meeting?" "2 weeks from now," she replied. 2 weeks? They were threatening legal action, and the soonest he could address it was 14 days away? "Great," Mark muttered. "I'll be there." He hung up and set his phone down with a thud. This wasn't just some simple misunderstanding. Something wasn't right. Why were they so insistent on this rule? And why did it only seem to apply to him? That's when it hit him. He had never seen any of his neighbors parking in their driveways. Not once. Every car was neatly tucked away inside a garage, as if they were afraid to break some silent agreement. Was everyone just going along with this? Or was there more to it? Mark glanced out the window at his car, sitting harmlessly in the driveway. It was his property, his home. He wasn't about to back down. But something told him. This fight was just beginning. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple, Mark stood in his driveway, arms crossed, staring at the latest violation notice pinned under his windshield wiper. Third one this week. His patience was wearing thin. He had parked in the same spot for days, refusing to back down, and yet the HOA kept escalating their warnings. What was their end game? The sound of shuffling footsteps pulled his attention to the sidewalk. Turning his head, he spotted an elderly man, thin and slightly hunched, standing just outside Mark's fence line. The man glanced around nervously before speaking in a hushed tone. "You should be careful, son." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" The old man took a hesitant step forward. "They've done this before." His voice was low, as if he were afraid someone might hear. Mark's grip tightened around the violation notice. "What do you mean?" The old man exhaled, shaking his head. "The HOA. They target people. They pick someone, make up rules, issue fines, and if you fight back, they turn your life into hell." Mark's stomach nodded. "That's ridiculous. This is supposed to be a homeowners association, not some kind of mafia." The old man gave a bitter chuckle. "You'd be surprised. They push and push until you either give in or give up. I've seen families pack up and leave just to escape them." His face darkened. "The last guy who lived in your house? He fought back too. And then, one day he was gone." A chill ran down Mark's spine. "Gone?" The old man nodded grimly. "Moved out. Or at least, that's what they want people to think. One day he was fighting them, and the next, his house had a "for sale" sign on the lawn. No one saw him pack. No one saw him leave. It was like he just vanished." Mark swallowed hard. There was no way this was real. HOA boards were known for being strict, sure. But this? This sounded like something out of a conspiracy thriller. And yet, something in the old man's expression told him he wasn't exaggerating. Mark glanced around, suddenly aware of how quiet the neighborhood was. No kids playing outside. No distant sound of laughter or conversation. Just the faint hum of porch lights flickering on. "Why hasn't anyone stopped them?" Mark asked, his voice lower now. The old man sighed. "Because they make sure there's nothing to stop. They bury people in legal threats, drown them in fines. And if that doesn't work..." He looked toward the nearest HOA security camera mounted on a street lamp. "They have other ways of getting what they want." Mark felt a cold unease settle in his chest. This was bigger than just parking violations. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were orchestrating something. But why? What did they gain from forcing people out? The old man took a step back. "You seem like a good guy, Mark. Just be smart about this. If they see you as a threat, they won't stop." Mark nodded slowly, watching as the old man turned and shuffled back toward his house. This wasn't paranoia. This was a warning. A real one. And suddenly Mark wasn't just frustrated anymore. He was scared, but fear had never stopped him before. If they wanted a fight, he was ready to give them one. Mark had never been the paranoid type, but after his conversation with the old man, he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The way the HOA kept escalating their warnings, the vague legal threats, the eerie silence from his neighbors, it all felt deliberate, calculated. So that night, as the moon cast long shadows across his driveway, Mark took action. He pulled out a set of motion-activated security cameras he had stored from his last apartment and installed them around his house. One above the garage, another angled toward the driveway, and a third near his front door. If the HOA was playing dirty, he was going to catch them in the act. And it didn't take long. The next morning, Mark walked outside to find another violation notice tucked under his windshield wiper. Fourth one this week, but this time he didn't feel frustration. He felt something else. Anticipation. He rushed back inside, grabbed his laptop and pulled up the footage from the night before. As the video loaded, his heart pounded against his ribs. What he saw made his blood run cold. At exactly 2:37 a.m., a hooded figure crept onto his driveway. The person moved quickly, slipping between the shadows, but Mark could still make out the HOA badge clipped to their belt. The figure reached into their pocket, pulled out a pre-written violation notice and carefully placed it under his windshield wiper. Mark's jaw tightened. They weren't even checking his car. They weren't even pretending to follow a rule. They were just planting fake violations. His fingers clenched into fists as he watched the footage play out. This wasn't about parking. This wasn't about rules. The HOA was targeting him, plain and simple. And then, the final blow. The figure stepped back, seemingly admiring their work, and for a split second, they turned toward the camera. The hood slipped just enough for Mark to see their face. It was Greg Thompson, the HOA president himself. Mark stared at the screen, barely breathing. This wasn't just some overzealous HOA board following weird rules. This was corruption. This was deliberate. His car wasn't violating any regulations. They were making it all up. Mark leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Why? What was their goal? His mind raced. The old neighbor had warned him that they'd done this before, that they pushed homeowners to the breaking point, drowning them in fines until they either paid up or moved out. Were they trying to force him to leave? And if so, what were they really hiding? Mark wasn't scared anymore. He was angry, and if the HOA thought he was just going to roll over and take it, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Mark sat at his kitchen table, staring at the security footage on his laptop. The anger bubbling inside him was no longer just frustration. It was determination. He had them. The proof was right there. The HOA president himself, sneaking onto his property in the dead of night, planting fake violations. But Mark knew evidence alone wasn't enough. He needed to hit them where it hurt. So he spent the next 2 days preparing. He printed out every single violation notice, highlighted the inconsistencies, and compiled copies of the HOA's official handbook, the one that had no mention of a driveway parking rule. He even downloaded the footage onto multiple flash drives, backing it up in case they tried anything sneaky. And then, on Thursday evening, he walked into the HOA meeting like a man on a mission. The conference room inside the community clubhouse was packed. Rows of neatly arranged chairs faced a long table where the HOA board sat. 7 members, all stiff-backed and stone-faced. At the center, Greg Thompson, the HOA president, sat with his hands folded, his expression unreadable. But Mark wasn't intimidated. He strode to the podium, placed his files down, and cleared his throat. "I'm here to address the violation notices I've been receiving." His voice was steady, controlled. Specifically, the ones about my car being parked in my driveway. Murmur rippled through the audience. A few neighbors exchanged glances, but most kept their faces neutral. Greg leaned forward, clasping his hands. Mr. Reynolds, as we've stated before, overnight driveway parking is against HOA policy. Mark smiled, but there was no humor in it. That's funny, he said, pulling out his copy of the HOA handbook. Because according to your own rules, there's nothing against it. He flipped to the parking section, holding it up for the audience to see. Not a single mention of driveway parking restrictions. Silence. Greg didn't even blink. It's an unwritten policy, he said smoothly. Something we enforce to maintain the community's aesthetic standards. Mark chuckled. Right, an unwritten policy. Kind of like how it's also an unwritten policy for you to sneak onto my property in the middle of the night and plant fake violations on my car? A gasp echoed through the room. Greg's face twitched. Mark pulled a USB drive from his pocket and held it up. Because I have footage of exactly that. You trespassing on my driveway. Placing violations for a rule that doesn't even exist. The room was dead silent. One of the board members, a woman in her 60s, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Another nervously adjusted his tie. They hadn't expected this. Greg, however, didn't flinch. He leaned back, crossing his arms. That footage means nothing, he said smoothly. HOA board members have the right to enforce rules. And if we determine a car is in violation, we have the authority to issue notices. Mark narrowed his eyes. Even if the violation is fake? Greg's jaw tensed for a fraction of a second before he exhaled. The board's decision is final, Mr. Reynolds, Mark smirked. They were squirming. But he wasn't done. Well, here's my decision, he said, placing both palms on the podium. If this harassment doesn't stop, I'll be taking legal action. And since I have concrete evidence of your misconduct, fraud, trespassing, abuse of power, I'm sure my lawyer will have a field day with this. Greg's fingers curled against the table. For the first time, he looked rattled. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, the woman on the board cleared her throat. Actually, she said, flipping through a folder, we've recently updated the handbook. Mark's stomach dropped. What? She pulled out a freshly printed document, crisp and official-looking. Section 5.3b, she read aloud. Effective immediately. All vehicles must be parked inside garages overnight to uphold community standards. Mark stared at her, at Greg, at the smug expressions creeping back onto their faces. They had changed the rules. Right there, on the spot. The audience murmured in confusion. Some looked shocked. Others, those who had likely dealt with the HOA's antics before, just shook their heads in resignation. Mark felt his pulse pounding in his ears. They were covering their tracks, twisting the rules to make themselves untouchable. But they had just made a critical mistake, because now Mark had proof that they were changing policies purely to justify targeting him. He took a deep breath and forced a grin. Perfect, he said, slipping the flash drive back into his pocket. I'll make sure my lawyer gets a copy of that new rule, too. I'm sure a judge will find the timing very interesting. Greg's smile faltered. For the first time, he looked worried. Mark turned, walking toward the exit. He had come for a fight, and this was far from over. Mark didn't waste any time. The moment he walked out of that HOA meeting, he knew there was more to this than just parking violations. The way they had instantly changed the rules, the smug confidence on Greg Thompson's face, it all pointed to something bigger, deeper, and much dirtier. If they were willing to lie about something as small as a parking violation, what else were they hiding? That night, Mark sat at his computer and started digging. Public records, financial reports, tax filings, anything he could get his hands on about the HOA. It wasn't easy, but after a few hours, he found something strange. The HOA collected thousands of dollars in fines every year, yet there was no record of where that money actually went. No reports of it being reinvested into the community. No maintenance expenses, no improvements, no upgrades. It was like the money just disappeared. Mark's pulse quickened. They weren't just issuing fake violations, they were profiting from them. But he needed more proof. The next day, he paid a visit to his elderly neighbor, the same man who had warned him about the HOA before. The old man's eyes darkened when Mark mentioned what he'd found. "So it's still happening," the neighbor muttered. Mark leaned forward. "What do you mean?" The old man sighed. "You're not the first one, son. They've been running this scam for years." Mark listened intently as the neighbor told him about a previous homeowner, a young couple who had lived in Mark's house before him. They had fought back against the HOA too. Just like Mark, they had received fake violations, endless fines, and legal threats. The stress became unbearable, and in the end, they sold the house and left. Mark clenched his jaw. That's why the HOA did this. It wasn't about rules or community standards. It was about forcing people to leave. And now he finally understood why. The HOA doesn't want homeowners, the old man explained. They want turnover. Mark frowned. Why? The old man pointed down the street. Who do you think buys the houses after people leave? Every time someone gets forced out, the same real estate investors swoop in, buy the property for cheap, and then sell it for a profit. Mark's breath caught in his throat. It was a money-making scheme. The HOA created fake fines to pressure homeowners into selling. Then, investors with ties to the board bought the homes at a discount. It was a cycle, one that made Greg Thompson and his allies filthy rich. And now, Mark was their latest target. But unlike the others, he wasn't going to run. Instead, he was going to expose them. And this time, they wouldn't be able to cover it up. Mark knew that if he wanted to take the HOA down, he had to be smart. He had enough evidence to raise suspicions, but he needed a smoking gun, something irrefutable that would destroy them. So he set a trap. Using a small recording device hidden inside his phone case, Mark attended the next HOA board meeting. This time? He didn't speak. He didn't argue. He just sat quietly, watching, waiting. Greg Thompson smirked at him from across the room, his confidence unshaken. The board had tightened their grip since Mark's last confrontation. More fines, more warnings, even a threat of legal action against him. But Mark wasn't intimidated because tonight they were going to expose themselves. As the meeting progressed, one of the board members, a man in his 50s with sweat glistening on his forehead, leaned over to Greg and muttered, "What are we doing about Reynolds? He's not backing down." Greg scoffed. "Doesn't matter. We'll bury him in legal fees like we did the last one." Mark's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. Another board member chimed in. "Maybe we should ease up. He's got footage. If this gets out—" Greg cut him off. "It won't. No one's going to believe some homeowner over the HOA." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Besides, we've been doing this for years. No one's caught us yet." Mark's hands clenched, under the table. They had just admitted it. On tape. The meeting continued, but Mark barely heard a word. He had everything he needed. The proof, the confession, the final nail in the coffin. The moment he got home, he uploaded the recording to multiple backup drives. Then he contacted a lawyer. And the next morning, he went public. Mark sent the recording to local news stations, homeowners in the neighborhood, and a legal team specializing in HOA corruption. It spread like wildfire. Within days, the HOA was in chaos. Board members resigned. Homeowners who had been forced out came forward with their own horror stories. The state attorney's office opened an investigation. Greg Thompson? He tried to deny everything. But when confronted with his own voice on the recording, he had nothing to say. By the end of the week, the HOA was falling apart. Mark stood in his driveway watching as reporters hounded Greg for a statement. For the first time, the smugness was gone from his face. Mark took a deep breath. It was over, and this time, justice had won. The downfall of the HOA was swift and brutal. Under the weight of legal pressure, public outrage, and news coverage, the corrupt board members began dropping like flies. First, Greg Thompson resigned, his smug mask finally cracking under the scrutiny of lawyers and reporters. Then, one by one, the rest of his allies followed, trying to save themselves from lawsuits and possible criminal charges. Mark sat in the courtroom when the verdict came down. The HOA had been found guilty of fraud, harassment, and financial misconduct. Homeowners who had been unfairly fined were getting their money back. The illegal violations were wiped clean. And Greg? He was facing a very real possibility of jail time. Mark had won. For the first time since moving in, he felt like he could finally breathe. No more threats. No more fines. No more battles. Or so he thought, because just when he believed the nightmare was over, he stumbled upon one last chilling truth. A week after the court ruling, Mark received an anonymous letter in his mailbox. No return address, no signature, just a single sheet of paper. It read, "It was never about your car. It was always about you." Mark's stomach tightened as he reread the words. What the hell did that mean? He went back through everything. The fines, the fake rules, the intimidation tactics. Why had Greg targeted him so aggressively? Why had he been so relentless? And then he found it. Digging through public records, Mark discovered that Greg Thompson had personal ties to the real estate investors buying out the houses. But more importantly, Greg had a direct financial interest in Mark's home specifically. Mark's house had been part of a disputed land deal years ago. The HOA had wanted the property for their own development plans, but the previous owner had refused to sell. Greg had been furious back then because he had a secret stake in that project. When Mark unknowingly moved in, he became the new obstacle. That's why Greg had targeted him. It was personal. Mark sat back, his blood running cold. This wasn't just corruption. This was revenge. And now, Greg had lost everything. Mark glanced at the letter one last time before tossing it into the fireplace, watching the flames devour the words. Justice had been served. But the neighborhood? It would never be the same again. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.